Good afternoon. My name is Warren Klein, and on behalf of the Temple Emanu-El Streicker Center, I'm honored to welcome you to hear about one of Judaism's most riveting scholars. Memory is at the heart of our people. It is the source of our pride and sorrow, the glue that has held us together for millennia, even as we've been scattered across the planet. And no one has explored the meaning of Jewish history with more insight or passion than Dr. Yosef Yerushalmi, who wrestled with the important, if often vexing, question as to whether memory is enough to nurture a living culture. This is the sort of program that is at the core of the Streicker Center's work as we strive to promote Jewish values, traditions, and thought with events like this one. Today, we are proud to welcome a woman who has also devoted herself to such endeavors, most recently with her new book, Transmitting Jewish History, based on conversations with Dr. Yerushalmi, Associate Professor at the Center for Historical Research and head of the Jewish Studies program at the School for Advanced Studies in Social Sciences in Paris, and author of 3 other books on Jewish history. Sylvia Anne Goldberg joins us to speak about Dr. Yerushalmi's personal and intellectual journey and the mark he's left on Jewish scholarship and thought. Dr. Goldberg will be in conversation with Elisheva Carlebach, who has helped translate and publish the book, and Alexander Kay, who wrote the book's introduction. Elisheva Carlebach is the Salo Whitmire Barron Professor of Jewish History, Culture, and Society at Columbia University, as well as the current director of the Institute for Israel and Jewish Studies at Columbia. She is an award-winning author and has twice held fellowships for the National Endowment for Humanities. Alexander Kay is the Carl, Harry, and Helen Stoll Assistant Professor of Israel Studies at Brandeis University. His research includes the history of Jewish thought with a special focus on political thought, history of law, and theories of Jewish modernity. He is also an expert in Israel studies and on the relationship between law, religion, and politics, in particular the history of religious Zionism. Please join me in welcoming Sylvia Anne, Elisheva, and Alexander.
Thank you so much, Warren. Thank you to all our friends at the Streicker Center, and in the name of the Institute for Israel and Jewish Studies at Columbia University, I want to welcome everyone to a special conversation about a special conversation and the making of the book, Transmitting Jewish History. Professor Yosef Yerushalmi was my teacher, mentor, and doctoral advisor at Columbia University. Over the course of a decades-long career, first at Harvard and then at Columbia, Yosef Yerushalmi mentored dozens of scholars, many of them today occupying chairs in universities across the world. Those who crossed his path, whether as a student, an audience member at one of his memorable lectures, or even just by encountering his written work, knew that they were in the presence of something extraordinary. He was a person with a boundless interest in human culture and creativity. Literature, art, music, and poetry were among his staples. His writing style married a lyrical style with incisive analysis. He focused these gifts on some of the most urgent questions of Jewish identity as it played out in various eras of Jewish history. He never abandoned his deep reflection on his own responsibility as a historian of the Jews. Yerushalmi's introduction as a historian came with the publication of his first book, From Spanish Court to Italian Ghetto, a brilliant history, biography, and meditation on the world of Marranism, an early manifestation of concealed Jewish identity. Describing his subject's existence in the 17th century among Jew-hating contemporaries, he wrote, "Outwardly, all is politeness and gracious conviviality. All the while, the real thoughts and attitudes, the contempt he must have felt, are concealed beneath a smile and locked in the recesses of the heart. To unlock the secrets of a heart that beat centuries ago, only the most attentive reading of the sources Inquisitorial dossiers and rabbinic responsa, for example, could suffice. He noted the flat affect, the lack of echo when a contemporary traveler in Spain or Portugal, I assume it was he, uttered the word Jew, and it meant absolutely nothing. Centuries of anti-Semitism had done its work so efficiently that the lands that gave birth to Maimonides, Yehuda Halevi, and Nachmanides, where hundreds of thousands of Jews for over half a millennium had lived and created a brilliant culture, philosophy, poetry, medicine, astronomy, mathematics. This society had totally expunged the memory of one of the glories of its own history. The themes that emerged from his first book, the conundrums of Jewish identity under different circumstances, the place of anti-Semitism within Jewish history, what is remembered of the past, these strands continued throughout his work as a historian. Yerushalmi is perhaps best known for his classic work, Zachor, Jewish History and Jewish Memory, one of the most reviewed and cited works in the field for decades after it was published. It tapped into the then emerging field of memory studies and eloquently explored the gap between history and memory, between the work of academic scholarship and the meaningful memories tended and transmitted over time by an entire people. This was not an opposition between truth and falsehood, but between different sets of truths that operated within different realms of human culture. I don't know if there's a sentence in Zachor that hasn't been parsed by scholars and philosophers. It's become a classic work. It marked him as a distinctive voice in whose writing the consideration of the most profound questions of Jewish existence merged with their most crystalline expression. Haggadah and History, an illustrated book that showed his bibliophilic prowess as master of the history of a single book, the Passover Haggadah, and the ways in which Jewish history was reflected on its pages over time. The Lisbon Massacre and the royal image in Shevet Yehuda was Yerushalmi's meditation on the strategies Jews employed to survive as despised minorities within a variety of political institutions and states. Perhaps his most audacious feat was the one he applied to the master of the art and profession of careful listening. Sigmund Freud, in his Freud's Moses, Judaism Terminable and Interminable, his informed and empathetic reading of Freud's grammar of denial of the Jewishness of psychoanalysis employed the strategies of the psychoanalytic profession to read Freud against the grain and to emerge with a profound new understanding of what the master meant. How could a birthday letter that began with the resonant Hebrew words, Ben Yakir Li Shlomo, have been heard by Freud? For all the attention it got when it was published, here's a book which contains treasures on every page. It still repays close reading. If I had to single out the one characteristic of Yosef Yerushalmi as historian, it would be his acute capacity to hear. He loved languages. He read and conversed fluently in so many of them. Ofra Yerushalmi, Zichronah Livracha, was a classical pianist, and Yosef loved music and opera. His writing on Schoenberg's Moses and Aaron is still another small classic. He listened carefully to his sources until he heard their hidden meaning and surveyed the drama and passion of Jewish history, constantly probing for insight and meaning. It is therefore with great pleasure that we reverse position, so to speak, and listen in on his conversation with Sylvia Anne Goldberg's Transmitting Jewish History. In this special book, we get to listen. And I want to thank Professor Sylvia Anne Goldberg for this wonderful work that she gifted to the world. I want to thank Alex Kay, Professor Alexander Kay, who provided a beautiful introduction to that book, and to Brandeis University Press, who produced this gorgeous book. And now I'd like to turn over the proceedings to our main event, to Professor Kay, who will be asking Professor Goldberg questions in this conversation that's sure to be fascinating. Thank you for listening.
Thanks so much. I find it quite surreal to be in this position. Sylvia, I'm not sure that I've ever told you this, but when the book first came out in French, I was just finishing up my doctoral studies. I managed to get my hands on the book and couldn't wait till I got home to read it. I still remember being on the M5 bus in Manhattan and tearing through its pages and being just overwhelmed by what a beautiful composition it is, at once so intimate and also so expansive and philosophical. And any reader of the book, and I hope there will be very many in whichever languages it's published in, will immediately see that the core of the book is the relationship between you and Professor Yerushalmi, as you had these conversations over an extended period of time. So perhaps I could begin by asking you how the two of you met and how the relationship between the two of you came to be and developed over the years.
Thank you. Thank you, Alex. I would like to thank before and say it very loudly that the kingpin of this publishing of a book in English was Eliseva Karlbach, because the book was published in France and it was published in 2012. So from the moment it appeared in France until the moment it was published now for the English audience, there is a big gap, I think. And without Eliseva, it could not have been. So thank you again, Eliseva. Thank you also, Sylvia. And I would like to thank the press who did a beautiful job with the book. So, how did we met with Yosef Yerushalmi? I think we met exactly at the moment he became Yerushalmi in France, because we met in 84 from the last century when he came to Paris to present his Zachor. He was up to be translated and published in France. So we met in a very small place where he presented his work. I was then finishing my own dissertation thesis, and I took the opportunity to speak with him. You know, I took him and I said to him, you know, I'm so thrilled by your book, and it's so important for us in France to have this kind of book, because the state of Jewish studies in France is quite poor, and it was especially at the moment we were quite behind all that was appearing and publishing all the time in English, or even in Hebrew. You know, the translation were not at the top, let's say. And for us, I mean, the small wing of people who are dealing with Jewish studies in France, it was truly a big moment to have such a book translated in French. So we started to talk about my work. He was astonished because I spoke Hebrew. and considering who are the French Jews, he supposed that no one in France could speak Hebrew. So it was the first surprise. And I think maybe this is how we became friends. After that, he started to teach at the École des Hautes Études, where I was at the moment a student, and afterward I became an associate professor, and he was invited every year to give a seminar as a guest, and it was a month long, and he gave a few lectures, and it's the way we built our friendship, from friends. And at the moment, we wrote letters also. It's not like today when you are sending an email. So we were writing each other, and we were talking about many topics about Jewish history. And also, I think it was the way how we started these conversations. So it's a long story. But the book itself, it came much later. It was my publisher, Hélène Monsacré, who published my books in French. She was aware of my friendship with Yosef Yerushalmi, and she asked me to ask him if he would agree to give a kind of a conversation, between him and me and myself. So this is how it started. And at first, he was interested, but he didn't say yes. It took him maybe a few months, maybe a year, I don't remember exactly, to say, yes, I am interested. By the end, I want to do it. So we made a few interviews. It was recorded, and but it was not once, at a time. We made many recordings upon the years. So it happened that I came to New York and we recorded these interviews for 1, 2, 3 days. Afterward, we were continuing the conversation by mail, by letters, and he came to Paris and we started over, and he came back on things he said already to correct and say other things. And when the book was almost finished, he didn't want to read it. So it stopped completely.
Do you know why?
It's very complicated to give a real reason. I think there were many reasons. At first, I think he was sick and tired and could not read the interviews. He did not have the patience. And even if I sent him the recording, at first he told me, yes, I'm very happy, I can hear it, but it was too much for him. This is one side. From the other side, I think he was maybe a bit scared about what he told me to see this published. But he never came back on the contract. So we waited, and after that, we decided with offer, with the offer agreement, and you can read in the book what you wrote about this, that we decided to publish it.
Yes, because the book eventually came out after his death.
Yes. He passed away in 2009, then the book was published in 2012.
Yeah, it's interesting, the initiative of your publisher was very insightful. And the fact that he said yes was a big deal. It's interesting to me, at least, that, of course, you'd had this friendship and a scholarly exchange for many, many years, decades by that point. At the same time, for all of his cosmopolitan nature, for all of his multilingualism, for all of his, travel, he spent a lot of time in France, in Israel, many other countries, really he was a New Yorker. He was born in New York, he was educated in New York, and apart from a brief stint in Harvard, that's where his entire sort of professional life was based. And he had many students in the United States. And it makes me wonder if there was something that made it a little bit more permissive for him to open more to you as someone a little bit outside of the immediate circle where he spent most of the time that he was working.
Yes, I agree with you. I think you are absolutely right. It was probably because I was completely an outsider. I wasn't a student of him. And, the French audience was quite far away from all the students and the friends and the audience he has already in the US. So it was also a way to be able to say things that he would have said if it was to somebody who was much closer to him. I mean, geographically closer.
Yes. So let me ask you to talk about one particular, really, in a way, the core of the book, which is an image which is on the front of the book in the English translation, and I'm going to show it on the screen now. It's a painting by Paul Gauguin, and let me just share the screen so the audience can see it also. Excuse me, just one second. Here it is. Yeah, so this is a painting by Paul Gauguin. The name of the painting is "Where Do We Come From? What Are We? Where Are We Going?" That's the name of the painting. It's from 1897-8, and it's hanging in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, not far actually from where I'm sitting now. And as you write, Yerushalmi reported that this painting, sort of sitting in front of this painting and pondering it, was really what was the instigator for him to pursue his life of scholarship, particularly in Jewish history, and self-exploration through Jewish history. And I'm wondering if you'd be willing to share your thoughts on what you think it was in this painting that he saw, and what was it that he was trying to find. That Gauguin poses these questions: where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? What is it that Yerushalmi was looking for?
Yes, first of all, I would like to say that this is also the cover, a beautiful cover of the book, thanks to Brandeis. So it's quite amazing to see it. I think Yerushalmi is explaining in the book that Judaism was something who was completely himself, but completely also a problem for him. And he's explaining this at length in the book. But I would like to read what he said about the painting. He said this: "My choice to study history is linked to a specific event. I don't recall how old I was, perhaps 20. I went to a Museum of Fine Art in Boston and saw one of Gauguin's most famous paintings, an incredibly long canvas done during his stay in Tahiti. The painting impressed me less than its title. Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going?" And he's adding, "I had studied Jewish texts through my childhood in a traditional way, without any introspection, and I realized that all this knowledge did not enable me to answer the question asked directly by Gauguin's painting. That's why I hoped that practicing history would allow me to answer the first two components, if not the third." Okay, I will not read it completely, but I think this is quite important, because for Yerushalmi, Judaism was, I think, the core component of his personality, but also he was always dealing with what to do with his own Judaism. And Eliseva mentioned quite rightly that he was a man of a very deep culture. He was skilled in many, many things, much more than just history. Let's say that history is small. It's not, but let's say it like this. And I think for him, one of the answers may be understood in what he wrote in Zachor, because for him the goal of history became a goal for all the Jews, and it was also the title of a book which was published for, the fallen Jews. Because for him, he understood that there was something that changed during the 19th century with becoming of Jewish history as a scientific matter, which made a difference between traditional Judaism, performing the mitzvahs and everything, and having something else, who could be a legacy of history. And I think that for him, the future of the Jews could not be separated from the legacy of history. So for him, it was a personal existential point, but I think that he thought that it was also an existential question for the future of the Jews of today. And this is probably why the title of Gauguin's painting, Where Are We Going?, was so harsh on him.
I read a little about the painting. It struck me. I have no idea if this was somewhere unconsciously or consciously in Yerushalmi's own mind. But Gauguin had a deeply Catholic upbringing, and went on to have an ambivalent relationship with the Catholic Church. But Catholic teachings are embedded in the painting, even as he's kind of struggling with that relationship. Mm-hmm. Not to make an exact analogy, but it's interesting. Yerushalmi once called himself to his graduate students. He called himself a heretic. He did that jokingly, I think. What he meant was that he was a searcher, but not in a traditional Orthodox sense, at least not anymore. His family upbringing was, he'd moved away from like his Cheder roots in many senses. But I was wondering if he related to Gauguin consciously in some other way. But there's something else about Gauguin, which is that he's French, of course. You're of course a renowned French scholar. What language did you speak when you had these conversations?
Depended on the context. We started officially in French, but it did not last long. After a few moments, we started to speak freely, and freely meant in English or in Hebrew, or sometimes in German. Depended on the context of what he was saying.
That's wonderful. He writes that even though he was born and raised in New York, his first language was Hebrew, actually.
Yeah.
And the fact that you say that you met and bonded over the Hebrew language, I wonder if there was something very sort of primal about you sharing that linguistic connection.
Yes, but we had also the Yiddish connection.
Well, some things can only be done in Yiddish, I suppose.
Yeah.
There's something else that I think that you share with Yerushalmi apart from the linguistic connection, which is I'm going to suggest this. I don't know if you'll agree, but I think in different ways in your own work, the two of you respectively, share this interest in an engaged scholarship. In other words, you're both extremely rigorous, serious scholars, but you're not willing to let scholarship just separate itself entirely from society. And in terms of your Jewish scholarship, you're not willing to let it separate itself from Jewish community and the interests of, the lives of Jews. And I'd be so interested to hear your thoughts about his own sort of the relationship in his own work and his life on the engagement between his scholarship and his sort of life as a Jew. And did you talk about that? Do you agree with him over the way that he did that? Do you see it differently? How does it work out in your own life and work? I'd love to hear your thoughts about those very big topics.
Yerushalmi was paradoxically engaged with the transmission of Judaism. I think that he chose specifically a way to transmit a lot of things from, let's say, the outside side of the traditional way of transmitting. I think he has done it completely consciously. It was not unconscious. He could have stayed in the traditional way of transmitting Judaism, but he did not choose this way because I think he was taking into account the numerous amount of Jews who would not agree to hear anything about Judaism if it stayed only, let's say, in the four walls, of Judaism, of traditional Judaism. But you were one of his students, so you saw him, how he was transmitting the liturgy, the prayer, and everything was the legacy, but not only of history, but the legacy of Orthodox Judaism also. But he was also on the truth side. He chose to be transmitting both of the sides. I remember once we had a discussion when I was writing something for my own work, and he made me one remark, that you are only showing one side, that is the normative side. I remember this because I think it's very, very, very explicitly the way he chose to transmit the Judaism to everyone, not only to the Jews who chose to stay Jews.
That's so profound. And I, in preparation for this conversation, I was asked to offer a couple of my own reflections, and I was going to do that later, but let me just insert them just for a couple of minutes now. And then I think I'll ask you if there's any sections of the book that you may want to sort of give the audience a little teasing, a little taste of, and then we'll move on to questions from the audience. But what you said just triggered so many memories for me. The thing about Yerushalmi was that if you didn't know him well, you could be mistaken for taking him as just a very dry archival historian. If you didn't know him, you saw him give one lecture, say. He knew all the languages, he knew all of the archives, he was extremely meticulous. We spent, there was one seminar I remember that we spent a substantial amount of time discussing the tense of an auxiliary verb in a sentence in Kafka, because it was very important to understand the precise meaning. But that was only part of the story. And as you see in the book that you wrote, the whole of his scholarship was motivated, at least in large part, by his existential quest. And he was interested, in his own words, in finding the absolute, whatever that meant. And for him, it was deeply tied up with his own Judaism, not in some kind of abstract way, but in a very concrete way, like you say, in terms of the liturgy, in terms of the canon, in terms of the Bible. I visited him in hospital right at the end of his life, and he had the Bible right by the bedside from which he was reading. He was extremely deeply engaged in Jewish life and liturgy and practice. I write a little about this in my introduction. In the very final seminar that he gave to graduate students, he talked a little bit about faith and history and the relationship between them. He was, of course, devoted to history. He as you mentioned, and the book makes clear, he saw it as one of the ways to explore these existential questions. but he was also very clear about the limits of history. He knew that, as he put it, however well you know the archives, you will never really know how a person felt. You can never know how another person felt. It takes another kind of sense, not the historical sense, maybe sympathy, maybe empathy, maybe compassion, maybe something else. And faith was an aspect of that. He talked about faith, actually. And I remember him saying, as he put it, he was talking about this age-old question of faith and reason, or science and religion. And Zachor, in a way, is a commentary on that kind of question. And people who ask the question about the relationship between science and religion, faith and reason, often there are often sort of two ways of addressing that kind of tension. One is like, it's either all this or all that. It's all faith or all reason, or there's some way of kind of making it all fit neatly. And he resisted both of those approaches. For him, he insisted on keeping both sides of the equation very much alive, but he also resisted any neat synthesis or any neat solution. As he put it to us, he said, faith isn't meant to make your life easy. So you deal with it. But it was more than dealing with it. It was really an example of somebody who used every aspect of his intellectual life, but also his spiritual life, to seek something that was beyond himself, and something in the service of not only his own existential seeking, but the wider community. It was very inspiring as a student of his. And I think anyone who reads this book will get a sense of the thing that we're talking about here. I hope they do. And with that, actually, let me turn back to you, Sylvie, for just a final few minutes before we open to questions from the audience. I wondered if there were any sections of the book that you might want to just describe briefly, so people get a taste of it.
Yes, I think the book is fun. I think it's a real pleasure, not only because you can hear his voice, and I hope you really hear his voice, but also because he's telling many stories about the great figures who make Jewish history, but also about his encounters with these great peoples. One of the stories he told us was about his meeting with Gershom Scholem. With Gershom Scholem, for example, he had a long friendship. He has also many, many stories with other great figures, but the one with Scholem is particularly piquant, let me say, because it was a story between two friends who are meeting about collecting books. You know that Yerushalmi was a great collector. He has a beautiful and a huge own library with manuscripts. And Scholem was also collecting books. And both of them were, when they were meeting, they were speaking about the books, about the manuscript and gossips, and etc., etc. Once it happened that Yerushalmi was for a sabbatical in Israel, and he came to Scholem's house in Jerusalem, and they were talking about the books, and Scholem saw that Yerushalmi has bought a book from one of the bookshops, I think probably in Jerusalem also. And he told Yosef, this book belongs to me because this is my scholarship, it's not yours. Okay? But Yerushalmi was Yerushalmi. If I was me, I would have said, okay, take it. Please, my pleasure, go on. But Yerushalmi told him, okay, if you take it, you have to give me one from your own library. So it's, as we say in France, donnant, okay? A win-win, let's say in English. And they started to speak about what kind of book Yerushalmi could take in exchange of the one Sholem wanted from him. So this is a very nice story, for example, and it's fun. I will not tell it. I think you have to read it. There is also another very nice story about the way Yerushalmi did not get to the professorship at the Hebrew University. It was also at the instigation of Sholem. Sholem, as Gershom Sholem, thought that Yerushalmi should belong to the Hebrew University, not to any American university. So he managed a meeting between Yerushalmi and the dean at the moment. And they started to speak about what Yerushalmi could teach. But the way history was taught, Jewish history was taught at the Hebrew University was very, let's say, spared. And Yerushalmi understood from his meeting that he could not teach freely. He should have stayed in the limits of a period or geography. And it was not the way of Yerushalmi's teaching. So he did not take, a professorship at the Hebrew University. And he stayed in the US.
That story is funny, but also gives me a lot of relief. And to the many, many, many students of his at Harvard and later Columbia, I'm happy that he stayed. There are so many other stories that I could ask you about that go right from sort of Yiddish speaking drama camps in New York all the way through to almost the present day. But I want to give readers the chance to discover these things for themselves. And it looks like we're about at time to open up to questions from the audience now. So let me hand over to Warren and thanks so much for the conversation, Sylvie.
Thanks to you.
Thank you. Okay, our first question comes from Chaim. If I am not mistaken, Dr. Yerushalmi maintained a difference between the terms Marranos, Conversos, and New Christians because the terms meant different things. Did Dr. Yerushalmi maintain differences with other terms in other disciplines?
Shall I answer? Shall I say something about this?
Please.
Okay. Of course, there is a main difference. Marranos was a very negative term, to name the Jews who converted, and in a way, stay what we call crypto Jews. But Marranos meant pigs. So it was very negative. New Christian, so this is something else. New Christian didn't mean that the Jews who converted stayed in a way or in another in the Judaism. This is just a way to name the people who converted and became new Christians. So there is a huge difference, I think, in the history of the Jews after the expulsion of the Jews from Spain and their conversion in Portugal between the way they were named. And it's also a program. If you are talking about Marranos, you are not exactly talking about new Christians. It's quite different.
Okay, the next question comes from Sarah. Did you walk in Paris with Professor Yerushalmi and speak of the history of the Jews in Paris? For her, he brought Paris vividly to life when he spoke of the burning of the Talmud at the Hotel de Ville in 1242.
Okay, when he taught at the École des Hautes Études 1 year, the topic of his seminar was the Jews of France. And what he chose was the topic of emancipation. And it was very interesting because he didn't start at all with the emancipation, neither with the French Revolution. He started way decades, centuries earlier, to explain that there was something on the way quite before the French Revolution. And I don't remember at least, but I'm quite sure that he didn't start with a medieval period. He started also with a modern period where the Jews in France were clandestine, were not allowed to stay in France, because they were not allowed until the French Revolution, but they were there.
Thank you. Daniel asks, it's hard to read Zakor without detecting a pessimistic streak, a sense that history was a kind of pale substitute for the vitality of Jewish memory, the whole idea of history as the faith of fallen Jews. There was also a kind of melancholy in his bearing, but this person remembers that he was gifted a journal with a French essay that he had written sometime in the 80s called A Field in Anecdotes Towards a History of Jewish Hope. I was wondering if you might comment on what Jewish hope meant to Professor Yerushalmi and how these pessimistic and optimistic tendencies converged in his work.
Okay, so I have already said that Judaism was the sense of Judaism, and the way to be a Jew was something deeply existential for him. But also the feeling that it may be lost was very deeply inside him. And I think it could explain also the way he was transmitting everything under the name of history. So for him, the hope was something which was, let's say, half and half, part of an optimistic side and the pessimistic side. He has a great nostalgia somewhere deeply inside him for the way it was once. But he has also a pessimistic approach to the future. And especially at the end of his life, he was talking a lot about what we could say no future. No future about the planet. It was long before we were talking about this as it is today, because it was in the first decade of the 21st century. But he was already plainly conscious of dangers inherent to the mixing of identities and all the persecution, tribulation the Jews had during the centuries. And I think he was also conscious of the way that probably or perhaps or maybe it will not stay anything from what he knew. So I think that for him, hope was a constant. It's like it was for him like a way of being alive. But being alive for him meant also knowing that there is death. So this is also a paradoxical side of Yerushalmi. I'm not sure I have answered. But
that was great, thank you. Sam wants to know, who are the thinkers, religious or not even Jewish at all, that Yerushalmi credited with influencing him most?
Wow, there were many. There were many. In the book, he mentioned a lot of them. So it would be difficult just to mention one of them, but they were, and in many fields, not only, of course, in Jewish history. Of course, Beon was absolutely influential, but many others also. So you have to read the book, definitely.
Good. And of course, we've been linking a link to purchase the book, and we'll put that up one more time as well for those who are interested. Lawrence asks, What has happened, or what was supposed to be, of his magnum opus, his translation and edition of the Shevet Yehuda?
I can speak to that very briefly. He never completed the second volume of annotations and commentary to the book that he had hoped to complete. He did complete a translation. At one point, shortly after he passed away, Ofer Yerushalmi actually gave me a copy of that translation. I tried to have it published in a series that was supposed to get started at Harvard University Press, that was supposed to be kind of like the Yale Judaica Classics series. Nothing happened with that, but apparently several different attempts have been made to get clear rights for that translation, and it is currently tied up in limbo. That is contractual issues. So that's the last I heard of it. I do know that there were several people, both Jeremy Cohen of Tel Aviv University, who did put out a something of a companion volume. Professor Bernie Cooperman of University of Maryland has been working on that. If there's any movement, many people would be very gratified because it's a beautiful translation.
Thank you.
He speaks about this, in the book, but he says also that he never finished because he didn't grasp the whole personality of the author. So for him, it was not possible to finish something that he has not understood completely.
Question from Peter. Historians today look at the third question, I guess this is going back to the painting, where are we going, as an important role for historians to address. Yerushalmi seems to have refrained from considering how the legacy of history would affect our future. Why do you think he did so?
I don't have an answer.
Okay, that's okay. We'll move on to another question. David wants to know what happened to the books in Professor Yerushalmi's personal collection, perhaps his archive, if someone could speak of that.
Elisheva?
Some of his archive is at Columbia University. Most of it available to scholars if they make an appointment to look through. Some personal correspondence is embargoed until some long future date. And as far as his book collection is concerned, I believe that it was sold by him toward the end of his career. I don't know if it was kept in one whole. Alex, you may have some comments on that.
Yes, I was around when that was happening. The bulk of it went to one buyer. I don't know. I don't remember the precise details. I mean, it was a vast collection. As I recall, the bulk of this sort of really valuable collection had previously been sold. But what remained was sold mostly to one buyer. There was some frustration because already at that time, it was already hard to sell books, actual physical books, but there was a buyer in the end.
Thank you. Question from Peter. You mentioned how Yehuda Amichai encouraged him to write a short story about his petty thievery. Could you discuss Yerushalmi's views of the relationship between literature and history?
I think all the students of Yerushalmi could have something to say about this. Because for Yerushalmi, the way you were writing was absolutely the main core of the writing of history. So I remember that Marina Russo one of his past students told us in a book that was published in France that he was telling his, in the classroom that, the novelists are using history. So why don't the historian don't use the novelist? And for him, the way you were writing was very, very important. And this is also an explanation about the wide audience he get to this book. It was not dry writing. It was something which was, it's a beautiful writing. So literacy was very, very important to him.
Yes, I would also add that he felt that there were certain aspects of the human imagination and spiritual yearning that historical writing couldn't quite address or capture. But when you got to literature, there was more room to extend and expand in other dimensions. So again, it wasn't only literature, it was every aspect of culture that he really ransacked in order to bring together the kind of work that he wrote.
He loved to teach Bialik's Halacha va'agada, which I think is sort of one telling of this sort of balance between you sort of the rigid rules of life and some kind of freer way of being, both of which are needed to really understand everything.
Okay, I think this is going to be our last question. David asks, did he have any room in his consciousness for a more 19th century romantic view of history, a la figures like Solomon Schechter, etc.?
It's difficult to speak on his name. I have only what he said to me. So if I had to say something about this, I would have said yes, of course, definitely. But I'm not sure that he would have said this himself. I think a romantic view of history was something which was inherent to the teacher he has himself, to the education he got from his parents, from his father especially, and also from all the books he read. But would he have said this? I'm not sure.
Okay, well, thank you all so much for joining us here this afternoon at the Streicker Center. It's really been a pleasure. I encourage all of you to purchase the book. There's a link in the chat. And thank you so much to Sylvia Anne, Alexander, and Elisheva for joining us this afternoon. Take care.